The topic of family business obviously is something we discuss a lot in our international business courses, especially in the context of emerging markets, where emerging markets, we see the dominance of family businesses, especially large family conglomerates, occupying the commercial landscape, accounting for a good proportion of the national GDP, employment, tax generation. They're very important to emerging markets, but of course their existence is also very much in place in advanced economies as well. In the United States, for example, we still have a lot of family businesses. Some of the larger, well-known ones include the Cargill family, a big international trader based in Minnesota. We have S.C. Johnson, personal care products based in Wisconsin, and many others as well. But also, when you look at the rest of the world, especially in Western Europe, Italy stands out as being the country where the family businesses still dominate, small, medium, and large, on all sizes, and still occupy a good proportion of the GDP and employment. So today's panel, I think, is very unique. Each of our very distinguished, very talented speakers brings a different perspective. Cecilia is going to get us started. Cecilia, of course, is Professor Xian Gu, is one of our own at Georgia State, a great scholar of family business, among other topics, associate professor in the Institute of International Business. I'm sure you read some of her work on family business, especially in the context of Asian family business, Chinese family businesses. Attila Yaprak, the longtime international business educator, scholar, has done a lot of work in the context of emerging market family firms as well. As you know, these are known as, in different terminology. And in Korea, for example, they're known as chaebols. In Turkey, they're known as holding companies. In Latin America, they're known as grupos, groups, and holding firms, trading companies, and so on. So Attila will share with us some of his experiences from his research. And of course, Francesca, representing the very interesting context, Italy, where, as I mentioned, family business still is a fascinating feature of the Italian economy. Francesca has done a lot of research, and she's publishing her work recently. I know, Francesca, you had a paper just this week at the AIB on some of your research. So, of course, the big question is, how do family businesses hold up in the middle of this disruption? A landmark event, certainly. We talk a lot about, in the context of family business, resilience. So how resilient are they in this current environment where they are encountering really radically new challenges? So I want to give them maximum time. We'll have a few minutes at the end for some questions and answers. As Hannah said, please share your comments and any questions through the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them. Our colleagues also will share their slides with you. Those will be available to you after the event as well. So with that, let me turn it to Cecilia. Cecilia, tell us what the plan is here today.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. So I'm gonna share the slides and go ahead and start the first question. So the first question we're gonna kick off the discussion is, what are the characteristics of a family business that help cope with the current COVID-19 crisis? A lot of studies in the past, typically in the family business literature, has compared family firms versus non-family firms in terms of their longevity and in terms of their performance. This study is one of them that use Spanish companies as the data set. So as we can see from this table, it shows that more than half of the family firms are actually more than 30 years old. So if we take 30 years as the normal span of one generation, we can see that most of the family firms are now in the second or the third generation. In comparison, the non-family business is relatively short-lived in this sample at least. Most of them are still in the first generation. And I find a lot of other studies have similar results in terms of comparing the longevity between family and non-family firms. So continuing this conversation, this is another well-cited study that compared the performance between family and non-family firms over time. We can see from the chart that although family firms tend to have a similar or even slightly lower performance in terms of earnings compared to non-family firms in the good economic times, it is quite obvious that family firms tend to outperform the non-family firms in, say, the 2008 financial crisis. So that leads to this very first question: why family firms tend to perform better as they more resilient compared to non-family firms during the past financial crisis? And then are they going to do the same for the current COVID-19 crisis? So in my opinion, there are at least 4 factors or characteristics that family business own that help them to cope with the current crisis. The first one being having a strong shared identity and values. So family firms is known for holding on to a clear vision, a very strong culture and values throughout, over a long period of time. So this helped the family firms to respond tactically to the turbulent environment without losing the unity of purpose or the long-term strategy. So for instance, SC Johnson, which is a well-known family firm, they are known for their value, strong value in terms of goodwill of people. So over time, they always invest heavily in human capital. For instance, they started to offer the paid vacation in 1900, the profit sharing in 1917, and then move on to start the pension plan in 1934. All of these consistent and coherent actions or values support the operation for the company during the wartime and the Great Depression. The second factor that I think contributes to family firms being resilient is their family control. So according to the past research, we find that in family firms, the founder and its controlling family members tend to have a higher level of ownership and also have a stronger presence in terms of board decision. So this kind of close family coalition or family control allows them to be flexible in terms of making decisions, react fast to the changing environment, and be able to deploy or even redeploy resources during the changing environment. The third factor that I think contributes to family business being resilient is its well-known long-term orientation. So it's no secret that family firms tend to have a longer term work horizon in terms of its investment. They tend to have a deeper pocket and to have more patient capital. So in our study on Taiwanese family firms, we find that when the Taiwanese family firms grow bigger in terms of family members, they are more likely to enter into the new market and diversify more. So a larger, higher level of diversification certainly will help the company to reduce risk during this turbulent environment. So for instance, take Samsung for an example, which is again another well-known family firms in Korea. Their sales of phones and electronic products dropped significantly during the first quarter of 2020, which is understandable. But then their memory chip business kind of got a boost. And part of the reason is because of the lockdown related use of the cloud-based servers. And also the family business started a company called Samsung Biologic 10 years ago. And this company focused on manufacturing vaccines and other pharmaceuticals. So this company's sales got grows exponentially during the past few months, and then it now becomes the third most valuable companies in South Korea. So again, this would help the company to diversify the risks and cope with the current crisis. The last point I want to highlight is social capital. So family firms in general tend to maintain a good relationship with various stakeholders, particularly the government and the local community. So they are also more engaged in corporate social responsibility, and this kind of relational capital would come in play and become a very valuable and rare resources for the company to leverage on and navigate through the crisis. So with that, let me hand over to Francesca.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you all for being here, actually. You already gave a very interesting overview of family business characteristics. So we are looking at businesses that behind the firm's activities have a family with a strong influence on business activities, as well as a strong willingness to pass the business across generations. So I think that one of the most important characteristics we should look at is tradition. And following recent studies, we should also focus on innovating through tradition. So it underlines the importance of maintaining the old experience while innovating, while responding to new stimuli and to the external, coming from the external environment. So family firms should make sure to not fall victims of the so-called recency bias. So they have to keep in mind to remember their past while looking for the future. In this case, if family firms are able to couple the old knowledge and practices that they've learned across times or even inherited from older and previous generations, then these might lead to positive outcomes and can help them being very resilient. So if they are able to use tradition to innovate, this can also be reflected from and seen, perceived from the customer side. As market research shows, customers are influenced, their choices are influenced from the perception of the product, the perception of the service, but also the brand attributes and the firm reputation. So tradition and innovating through tradition, it's something they should definitely maintain, and it's definitely one of their main characteristics. A second interesting peculiarity of family firms is their feeling of identification between the family and the enterprise. As a matter of fact, those two levels, those two dimensions are often perceived as if they were one single entity. So there is a strong emotional attachment between the two, and it makes it even harder for the business owner to let it go, to liquidate or close the firm in difficult times, in difficult periods. So these leads to psychological and social features, social aspects that are much stronger if compared to their non-family peers, that probably they don't even face some of those issues during their lifetime. But these can become costs. However, if the firm is able to leverage on these, this can be reflected as a sense of stability that can be shared across the whole community. The last characteristic I would like to talk about is the important relationship that exists between the employer and the employee, as both sides' loyalty increases in times of crisis. We have, from one side, the business owners that are doing whatever it takes, well, they're doing even more to make sure that the employees don't lose their job. We have examples of firms raising their salaries to as a compensation, as a reward for their employees working during the pandemic. We have examples of enterprises getting indebted to be able to pay their employees' salaries. We also have examples of managers cutting some of their benefits off. Like in Italy, they have given part of their paid holidays to their employees to make sure to maintain their job positions. So these leads to underlines a very important feature of family firms, which is valuing more the personal aspects compared to the economic aspects. Well, if you think about it in pure economic terms, it would make much more sense to let some of those employees go instead of getting indebted. But this also increases a sense of trust and loyalty between the two parties. But I said both sides' loyalty increase, and which means that the values that unite the business involve not merely the business owners, but also the employees. The workforce of family firms may be employed in the same firm across generations. So in the long run, this leads to sharing the same values, and employees may feel also personally attached, personally connected to the founders and the founding firms. So this sort of identification makes it not unusual for employees to even accept some payment reductions for the sake of the firm. So instead of seeing their firms going through bankruptcy, for example, in the worst case scenario. Well, there have been examples of these coming from the North Italy. For example, we have seen employees grasping money, collecting money to give to their employer as a thank you gift. So it's a symbolic gesture because they raised 3,000 euros and it won't change the destiny of a firm, of course, but it is something that shows gratitude in times of crisis, and it shows that they are thankful toward their employer. I look forward to hear Attila's thoughts about this. So I yield the floor to Attila.
Thank you very much, Francesca and Cecilia. I'd like to focus on some of the, shall we say, competitive advantages that family businesses, many of whom are internationalizing enterprises primarily from the emerging markets, not all, but primarily from the emerging markets, possess, that sort of separates them from their counterparts, meaning the internationalizing enterprises from the developed economies of the world. Studies show that these can be, not always, but can be, different sets of portfolios of skills, aspirations, corporate cultures, and so forth. And as a result, the internationalizing enterprises from the emerging markets may actually possess a portfolio of skills that sort of outpaces or gives them a specialized advantage, competitive advantage over their counterparts in the developing world, which help them cope with and respond to more efficiently to economic, market, and other kinds of crises. Though there are a good number of these that have been studied in the literature, of course, in our limited time, I will focus on only a few. First of all, one of these, which I think is very fascinating, is the institutional void argument. And here we're talking about these family businesses or family firms, apostrophe, prior experience in having navigated through the institutional voids in their home markets, which give them the competence and the confidence with which to respond to crises. For instance, the fact that they have lived in high inflationary environments, the fact that they have had to cope with inefficiently operating labor markets, the fact that they have had to navigate through inefficiently operating product markets, government regulations, and other kinds of market imperfections, sort of, gives them the capabilities with which they can respond to crises much more calmly, much more maturely, and presumably much more efficiently. The second one among these many that I've chosen to focus on is mindsets, essentially top management mindsets that embrace the notion of humility. That is to say, a mindset that appreciates the need to catch up to others in the world. So an aspiration to ride the value-added chain, or what some in the literature call the smiling curve, upwards. That is to say, brand building and simply becoming good in exercising or implementing their capabilities, so that they too can become like their developed country counterparts. And a part of this, of course, is their tolerance for ambiguity. The culture of frugality, that is to say, a culture of being able to extract the greatest amount of value out of the smallest amount of, excuse me, resources. And one that is the most fascinating, in my opinion, this is my personal bias, an ability to convert liabilities of foreignness into assets of emergingness. And this has to do primarily with foresight and mainly agility. The ability to learn faster, the ability to transform knowledge, faster, having gone through hardship in their backgrounds. The argument is that they will have developed capabilities which will help these firms convert what would normally be liabilities of foreignness, especially in the developed countries in which they operate, into assets of emergingness. When taken in primarily in combination, but even if taken independently, these are some of the capabilities that family businesses possess, that sort of gives them the opportunity with which they can respond to crises, whether these are market crises such as the financial crisis that we faced in the 2008 to 2012 period, or, for example, the COVID-19 crisis that we are facing today, more effectively than many of their counterparts. Incidentally, I have a reference page at the end of the slide deck, which I've put together. It's certainly selected references, not all of the references that speak to these issues, but I do have a few that I've selected in only one slide, not to declutter the slideshow here. So you are welcome to refer to some of those references if you'd like. One I'd like to point out or underscore is a study by Madhok and Kehani, which appeared in the Global Strategy Journal in 2012, which speaks to this converting liabilities of foreignness into assets of emergingness with many, many examples. So I would recommend that you look at that reference. Thank you. I will now turn the floor over to Cecilia.
Thank you, Attila. Let's now move on to the second question. What are the unique challenges for a family business during the current COVID-19? How can a family business convert these challenges into opportunities? I would like to start by sharing this very interesting article that was recently published in The Economist. This article actually compares the 2008 financial crisis with what we are experiencing now in the COVID-19. And the authors mentions that when the financial crisis rocked the world in 2008, the boardrooms turn to the corporate finance chiefs. So a good CFO can save a company. However, with the current COVID-19 pandemic, it is presenting a different challenge. Never before have more firms needed a hard-headed HR boss. So in other words, this article and many others along the line have highlighted that the current COVID-19 crisis that we are facing is less of a financial crisis, but more of a human crisis. So with that in mind, keeping those in mind, I would just want to highlight 3 challenges or liabilities that family firms may have in coping with the current COVID-19 crisis. The first is about search and retain talent. I'm glad to hear what Francesca mentioned, that family firms in Italy seem to be more friendly and demonstrate more care to the non-family members and employees. But based on other studies that may be using a different samples, including mine based on China and Taiwan, I've seen studies that look at the US data set. In general, we see that in family firms, non-family managers or non-family CEOs tend to have a higher chance of receiving CEO dismissal, for instance. They are more likely to be blamed when the performance goes down, and they also face a challenge such as career ceiling. So in other words, compared to family members or family CEOs, these non-family employees tend to have a lower job security, and the family company do need to work on the trust issues and the collaborations and loyalty with these professional managers. I see this as a possible liability if not done well, given the current challenge of recruiting and retaining skilled workers and talents. So, and that is the #1 challenge I think family firms may want to be more mindful of. The second is being overly cohesive. In the previous question, I talked about family firms have this clear and well-coded culture, a very cohesive culture, very clear value that can carry the family firms along. But then being overly cohesive could be detrimental as well, because it means there could be a lack of diversity in opinions. The company becomes overly selective and becomes intolerant for opposing voices. And because we are facing an environment that's rapidly changing, this could risk the company of losing touch and being squeezed out of the market. So, and that could be a challenge for the company. Last but not least, lack of transparency. Based on prior research, we see that being transparent is not the cup of tea for the family firms. In other words, family firms have a higher tendency to conceal their information, both good news and bad news indeed, from the public. Now, this could be a tactic choice because they want to prevent the leakage, of the secret, and maintain the strategic flexibility or avoid the public scrutiny. But then this is a special time where the stakeholders are anxious to know what is going on within the company. They would like to have very clear narratives about business strategy, dividends, and liquidity and valuation. So again, lack of transparency could come back as a liability for family firms in coping with the current COVID-19 crisis. So with that, let me pass on to Francesca.
Here I am. Thank you, Cecilia. Just to touch base on what you said, actually there are those 2 different behaviors that we can see on employers and employees. On one side is the strong relationship and the bonding existing between the 2, as I mentioned before. But of course, there is also, it might also happen that while family employees are actually more valued and appreciated, non-family employees can instead be seen as outsiders, or even their trustworthiness can be questioned. So it is just for the sake of time that I focused only on one side of the two behaviors. And this was one of the main characteristics, but thank you for underlining it. It's really completely correct. Yeah, so to go back to this second question, I already introduced the concept of innovating through tradition, and I think that this is definitely both a characteristic as well as a challenge, which can be transformed into an opportunity. As recent studies are showing, there is the possibility for family firms, the risk for family firm to have a paradox which sees both the willingness, the ability and the willingness to innovate. Let me explain a little bit more. There are the advantages of being family firms, among the others, the fast decision-making process, or usually shared long-term goal. But on the other side, there is the actual willingness to innovate, which is less strong in family firms, and it can even refrain them from innovating because they fear the risk of losing their roots and their traditions. So if family firms are able to overcome such a paradox and to not fall victim of the recency bias that I introduced before, so if they remember their past while responding to the future, then definitely this could be a challenge turned into an opportunity. A second characteristic, something that we are seeing specifically from this crisis, is the challenge on technology. So technology is becoming a key outcome for those firms that, instead of thinking that everything is doom and gloom and waiting for someone else to help them, actually responded with creativity, flexibility, and with a problem-solving attitude. So we have examples of firms that moved online from 0 to 100% in less than 2 days. And they are even testing if this can be taken in the future, if this approach can be taken in the future. I'm just thinking about the smart working, for example. But we have also seen firms that have simply opened a social media page or a website to engage, to do a first step toward the digitization. To use Italy as an example, despite the Italian backwardness in digital and the technological communications, and despite the fact that most family firms were still used to do business in person and face-to-face, even those that already entered international markets were trying to find different paths and channels to engage with their customers in person. Well, but because of the crisis, and thanks to the fact that also sometimes the ownership and management overlaps, they were able to respond quickly to the urge of moving online and increase their technological communication. So this was definitely a challenge that is being transformed into an opportunity. I don't have that much time, and I don't want to take too much time from Attila, but the last point I'd like to touch upon is one of the main challenges of family firms in general, which is their financial fragility. So it has been studied that family firms might suffer from lower opportunities and lower willingness to get indebted and to ask for financial help. But if they are able to use their family familiar wealth to support and sustain the firm during period of liquidity shortages, then this can play an advantage for them, can be even a better response, and can show a stronger willingness to win. So with this, I yield the floor to Attila. Looking forward to his insightful thoughts.
What I'd like to focus, many of the challenges and opportunities that family firms face have already been touched upon by Cecilia and Francesca. For example, financial fragility, financial vulnerability, and so on. So I'd like to focus on more on the inefficiency parts or the inefficiency idea. While family firms have been found to have a number of competitive advantages, which sort of gives them an opportunity with which to cope with crises, they also suffer from challenges that slow the pace of their ability to respond. One of these is, of course, inefficiencies. For example, inefficiencies in transferring knowledge, or perhaps I should say sharing knowledge among the multinational network, or internationalizing network that would give them effective response capabilities. A second one relates to, but related to the first one, is inefficiencies in internalizing and diffusing, after absorbing the knowledge, internalizing and diffusing crisis management capabilities across their network. And finally, I'd like to focus on inefficiencies again in reconfiguring their organizational structures so that their response capabilities can be enhanced. You know, there are, of course, cultural issues here as well, but we're going to get into cultural things in the next question and answer period. So I will save my comments on the culture thing for my next turnaround. But essentially, I simply want to focus here on inefficiencies in absorption, in diffusion, and in the appropriation of knowledge bases so that family businesses can cope more effectively with crises. I will now yield the floor to Cecilia.
Thank you, Attila. Let's move on to the last question. What are the roles of organizational culture or country culture in shaping family business strategy moving forward? Going back to what I shared earlier in terms of the liability of family firms in coping with the COVID-19, one thing that needs to be mindful of is the culture of more open communication within the organization. So again, transparency tends to be low in family firms, and thus it is particularly asked for from the stakeholders during this fast-changing, turbulent environment. So I see this as one of the key things that family firms need to work on. This is one study that we do in terms of information sharing and its impact on performance. We find that when family leaders, family controllers are more willing to share their information, particularly the information that is non-related to work, it actually has a very positive effect on non-family members' perceived trust in the supervisors or in the family leaders. In return, these non-family employees are more likely to voice their opinions, to ask questions, and to suggest for different routes to solve questions or problems. It will increase the job performance and also increase their tendency to stay in the company. So in other words, we do see a very effective way of encouraging voice and encourage intention to stay by sharing more information, just simply be more open in terms of communication. The second one is keep renewing. Francesca also talked about, and Attila also touched upon being innovative, embracing the new technology. So on the right, you will see this is a comparison between family firms versus non-family firms in terms of productivity based on those in the manufacturing sector. So family firms that is family owned and managed, as you can see from the table, is significantly lower in terms of productivity compared to other types of company. Even for those that are family owned but not family managed companies, they perform significantly better than the family owned and managed, but still slightly lower than other types of organization. So in other words, it's cause for the family business being more innovative, being more willing to act with speed, boldness, and originality. They need to tolerate those intellectual failures just to give time for the managers to do their thing and to prove their worth and try to be innovative and have this healthy atmosphere of trust is important moving forward. Last but not least, I will highlight the importance of building a stronger board. What I mean here is to increase the board diversity. Now, again, as I mentioned in the first and the second questions, family firms tend to have a very cohesive culture where family control tend to be high in the sense that a lot of the board decisions are made within the family members. The downside of it is that you are rejecting different voices, and this could, make the family lag behind in terms of innovation, in terms of reacting and adapting to the changing environment fast. So it is important to involve different backgrounds of, board members inside the boardroom and to share ideas. In particular, female involvement is important for family firms' decision-making and performance. Now, this is a recent study that was published in 2019. The authors actually compared the pros and cons of female involvement in the board decision in family firms. So as we can see it here, the advantages definitely outweigh the disadvantage, such that when you have more females involved in the family firms in their board decisions, you will see the firms are more likely to catalyze innovation. They would have increasing board monitoring ability. They are more likely to engage in CSR, and also it can kind of ease the tension between the socio-emotional and economic conflicts, etc. So with that being said, while we do encourage diversity and do ask for more involvement from the female role, when it comes to the female who happen to be the successor's mom or the founder's wife, things then would become more complicated. I just want to shout it out loud here. This is another very interesting study that was published in ASQ last year. It shows that when mom only stay as a mom, the mom role in the family domain, she will become the trustworthy third party that both the founder and the successor, or you may say the father and son, come to, and she may help to mitigate the business disagreements between these two guys. So for instance, during the dinner table, the son would just say, "Mom, tell dad to stop bothering me," etc. So she is a very effective figure to solve these business disagreements. However, when mom also participates in the board or serve as a VP, things will be very different. She is unlikely to stay impartial to business disagreements. And at the same time, the founder and successor will no longer see her as a trustworthy third party to really mitigate the disagreements between the two of them. So this will be another interesting add-on based on what I suggested to have more female involvement. The mom figure is more complex. So with that, let me pass on to Francesca. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. This was very interesting. You touched very interesting points. So we have seen how resiliently family firms have responded and are still responding to the crisis, but we've also seen that this is not so surprising, as they've always shown to be creative, flexible, and with a problem-solving attitude in response to times of crisis. So what we are witnessing right now, among the rest, is an agile production line conversion. So they are showing their ability to respond relatively easily and with extreme flexibility and agility by readapting their production line. So I can use some example of the Italian fashion industry, in which in the COVID-19 frontline, for example, we have seen Miroglio, a 70 years old textile and fashion industry firm, which completely changed readapted their production line to respond to local communities' needs and requests for masks. other well-known brands in the same industry have done the same, reshaped their production lines, their production processes to respond and help the country in similar ways. Among the others, there is Herno, Calcedonia, even Armani with their disposable coats. We have seen companies in other industries too. There is the example of a company from northern Italy that is in the motion sector control that changed their technology that was firstly targeted toward mechanical industry, but now they managed to switch it to mechanical devices, and they are already selling international. So such an agility shows that, well, family businesses may not be so well structured, but this also helps them with a flexibility in organization and in adapting to national, local, as well as firm level needs. Such an agile methodology helped them to take the step forward also for the technology and the digitization process that we've seen before. And they are even thinking of maintaining the lessons learned in the future. As I mentioned before, this smart working or moving activities online has shown to be even better than in the pre-crisis. So they are thinking to actually maintaining such a structure in the future too. Mainly because employees, for example, have shown to be more productive with this specific approach. However, if this is something specifically due to the situation because they wanted to support their firm in this specific time, or if it is because they are actually more productive, I think it is a little bit too early to state. But still, it is a huge improvement, and it is something that we need to keep in mind for the future. Something that gives instead a lot and a strong hope for the future, and that we are witnessing now, is the increased perception of the earth and the importance of having sustainability approaches that might be even responding to needs of cost reductions by using, for example, different energy, cleaner energies, or by transforming their waste into a sellable product, or even by selling their waste through the industrial symbiosis to a different firm that might use it as raw materials. So family firms have been active in responding to crisis by readapting their production processes, their offer, and even gaining from such periods of crisis. And we have also seen how, because of the often overlapping ownership and management, they were able to respond quickly and with a flexible approach effectively to the crisis. But something that really I care about is the sustainability and circular economy, which seems to be led by three main motives behind. So one seems to be the willingness to increase their reputation and their perceptions that the outsider and the customers have of the firm. A second main motive is seems to be the result of younger generations taking the lead, as younger generations are supposed to be more sustainability driven, but also the fact that they are actually realizing that this might help with cost reduction purposes, and they could also take advantage of countries' incentives. As a matter of fact, for example, Europe has an action plan for circular economy. They aim at helping firms in the transition through the circular economy. So I'm looking forward to Professor Yaprak, so to Attila's thoughts now.
I'll focus my comments on this question on really one idea, and that idea is the ability to combine ambidextrous knowledge bases on the part of family firms. And to be able to do this, many family firms, if not most family firms, have chosen to go through or to internationalize through primarily mergers and acquisitions in the past. I know that that form is now changing. I know that many firms are now preferring partnerships and other kinds of collaborative and entry modes when compared to mergers and acquisitions. But until recently, mergers and acquisitions provided, excuse me, family firms the opportunity with which they would be able to combine, to blend resources, and especially ambidextrous resources, meaning that they are able to combine both exploitative as well as explorative knowledge bases effectively, so that they would be able to respond to crises in a much more effective manner, in a much more agile manner, I should say. So perhaps I should stop here so that we can have some time for questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. I mean, what a fantastic set of ideas here. Obviously, we're not surprised. But I think it's interesting that we live in a very special time. We are in the middle of this unbelievable experiment where we're seeing a lot of transitions, a lot of transformations, and a big question that arises is how well will family businesses weather the storm, cope with this crisis, to what extent they'll be able to survive, which types of family businesses will be the casualties, and which ones will come out even stronger. And in answering that, I think you see the importance of different factors at different levels. There's the national culture, which we find in this discussion to be very critical. We find the ecosystem of the particular country to be very relevant. We find, of course, a difference between the large and small family businesses. A couple of questions have arose. First of all, there's a lot of praise from the participants, folks, panelists, for what you have shared with them. They are very appreciative. But several questions deal with the differences between the small and large family businesses. You may not have time to talk a lot about the questions, but we'll have you take a look at them and perhaps respond to some of these individually. But what I have observed as the family business gets bigger and bigger, becomes a conglomerate, diversified entity, they look more like their counterparts in the publicly owned companies. So they contrast themselves, actually compare themselves to large family-owned businesses, publicly owned businesses. So they become similar. The smaller firms, of course, will show more of their family culture and traditions, and the organizational structure will be simpler. You'll find much less use of professional managers in the organization and so on. There's just a few minutes left, but maybe I'll ask each of you to give us some concluding thoughts. Cecilia, we'll start with you. Perhaps you've seen some of the questions as well. You may choose to respond to one or more of them, or just give us some concluding talks. My concluding talk is that this is a fascinating topic, and it has become even more fascinating in this time. And I would urge all of you interested in the topic to actually start talking to family businesses, start collecting data, even perceptions, because they are in the middle of a fantastic period in terms of being social scientists, researching this phenomenon. Cecilia, your concluding thought?
Thank you, Tamir. And in fact, thank you so much for having me in this wonderful panel. And I enjoy sharing my point of view with the other wonderful panelists. So going back to the question that you highlighted, Tamir, on the small and large family firms, I think they are very different in several ways. First, small SMEs or family business, they are very constrained in financial resources. So you won't see the level of diversification like Samsung, like SC Johnson, or many other chaebols, as Attila mentioned, in these companies. So in other words, they could face more struggles in the current COVID-19 in terms of stack resources. The second, related to the diversification argument, they lack this group structure, right? They are not going to have this independently, legally independent company that are able to form these financial ties or business ties with each other. So the lack of this group connection, which going back to Attila's point that, you know, it will again make a huge difference in terms of organizational structure and decision making. The last point is, being a large MNE, you obviously are more open and more vulnerable to public scrutiny compared to when you are a small size mom and pop shop. So when it comes to being transparent, when it comes to financial incentive, or even the HR process, this could be very different practices that we're talking.
Thank you.
But overall, thank you.
Francesca, what are your concluding thoughts?
First of all, I want to thank you and all my colleagues for this amazing panel. I enjoyed it a lot. Well, I've read a little bit the questions, and I've seen that the main question is this one, the difference between the small and the larger. So, well, there are definitely differences, as Cecilia already highlighted, but I think that the flexibility and the ability, as well as I read the last question was about that they exhibit dynamic capabilities. So yes, small, medium firms definitely show these capabilities. But also there is, in Italy at least, we have seen that also bigger firms, so with much more than 250 employees, so large firms, have shown to be related with the employees too, and they are the ones that actually raise their salaries up to 750 euros more to thank them. So yes, there are lots of differences, but still we can see in some of those, not all of them, personal attribute, which is valued much more than the economic sometimes.
Thank you, Francesca. Attila.
One final thought. I will leave you with only one final thought. Of course, thank you to my co-panelists, and of course, thank you, Tamer, for making this wonderful panel, this opportunity available. But my final thought is this. I view family businesses as playing football with the Brazilian samba, you know. They're agile, they're creative, they are, having gone through hardship, you know, they are able to convert liabilities into assets. While their Western counterparts, I view them as playing football, like ballroom dancing. You know, one is doing the samba, the other one is doing ballroom dancing. It's very methodical, very, you know, it's very effective, you know, but it's, the creativity is really not there as much as you would find in, I knew you would like the Celso. I knew you would like my example here. So I see family businesses being very agile, and while, you know, their counterparts not being as agile. I hope this wasn't too off base, but
it's a great metaphor, Attila. And I should say, for some of our participants, you're talking about European football or soccer, not necessarily US football. So, but it's a great metaphor. With that, we will conclude. Hannah will have a few things, reminders for us, but I appreciate all of our participants today, and especially our very distinguished panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.